Well, Merry Christmas. Yeah, to everybody who's here and everybody who's watching us online. We're really looking forward to our Christmas service. Just put it up here. Wait a second. You're supposed to look like that. There we go. Put it, our Christmas service is Tuesday. Man, this is, my wife and I, this is kind of our favorite service of the year. And we're really excited about the Christmas service. And so we'd love to have you here for a part of that. And for our people who are watching online as well, just so you know, we have no services for next Sunday. Well, we are in our series that we are calling The Promise Kept. And I thought Brad did an amazing job last week, and just thank him for being here to do that. To get to this, I got to take you way back. So in 1997, I was the executive pastor at a church in Jacksonville, Florida. And in February of that year, my wife and I were taking a large group of people from our church across the panhandle to the other side of Florida into Pensacola, where there was something that just absolutely incredible was going on. And when I say incredible, at this point when we were going, there had already been several thousand, tens of thousands of people who had come to faith in Jesus as a part of this service. And by the end of this period, which they called a revival period, 200,000 people had given their life to Christ at this church, and 2.5 million people had attended a service there. And so we were on our way over. Amazing stories. Marriages had been restored. Addictions had been lifted. Lives were being changed in very real ways. And so we arrive at the church, and we'd been told ahead of time that we need to get there early. And if I were to tell you to get to church early, what would you normally think? Early. 30 minutes. 30 minutes early? That's early? We were told to get there 8 hours ahead of service. So service was at 7 o'clock. And when we arrived around noon, I believe, just before. So we ate lunch on the way in, and we got there. So roughly noon. My memory's not that good from 1997. This is the line. I asked a friend to send me a picture, and he's like, yeah, I actually have a picture. So this is where we are at 11 a.m. for a service that begins at 7. Can you imagine? By the time this service opened up, if you were to spin the camera around, that line just got wider as it went out and was 10 times longer than what you're seeing here. You could not even see the back of the line. People standing in line. Could you imagine that? Standing in line, like pulling up at next level and like, well, we got to get in line, go to church. But we didn't mind. We knew we were going to be there 7 or 8 hours. We were excited. And the whole thing, we just felt like we were standing close to something God was clearly doing. And so we attended the service. And after one of the services, we were there, I think, for a couple of different service nights. And so after one of the services, I think it was the last one, they would invite people down for prayer, just like we do. Hey, we'd love to be able to pray with you, except you would come down forward. And they would say, hey, just tell the person who's there what it is you need prayer about. And I had, at this point, been feeling like God was wanting Jody and I to go and plant a church. And what that means is you start a church from nothing in a town, generally probably where you're not at the time, and you're going to start a church. And so I felt like that was something that God wanted us to do. I did not know where we were going to do. We didn't know what we were going to do. We didn't have cities in mind. We just felt like God was stirring something in us. And so I come down front to be prayed for, and there was this lady who was praying, and I would call her a little lady. Now, I am short. If for me to call someone little, they got to be really short, because I was looking down on her, and the only people that I look down on in a conversation are children. Like, I don't look down on adults. And so she offers to pray for me. And this particular movement, they would want to touch you. They called it laying on hands. So they would want to touch you while they pray for you. So she reaches up and touches me. And in that moment, something happened that really is kind of hard for me to explain. And I wouldn't be able to do a good explanation of it. Let's just say God did something that had never happened in my life and has not happened since in a vision is the best thing that I can describe. He was just showing me something. And in the moment when that happened, it was all kind of instantaneous. I was annoyed. Now, not annoyed at God, don't take it as that. I have probably undiagnosed ADHD. And so while this is happening, all the music is still going on, and people are talking, and people are praying, and people are bumping in. In my mind, I can't concentrate on what God is saying right now. And so I'm just annoyed. And I tell God in my thoughts, I'm annoyed, which, He didn't get upset about or anything. But what happened in that moment where I thought that was suddenly everything just went silent. And then it went dark. I felt like I was still there, but I had gone like below the floor. It's kind of hard to explain. But all of a sudden now I'm in a space that is dark, but not like scary dark, not like at a church after hours at dark. You ever been in like a church storage closet on a Tuesday night at 10 p.m.? It's the scariest place on the planet. Haunted houses do not compare. So it wasn't like that. It was, I'm in this dark place and God just shows me something. But it wasn't like I was watching on a screen. It was like I was there. If you've ever had an experience like this, when you hear stories, people tell these kinds of stories, they're not dreams. They're as real as if you show up at a location and you were there. And I was there. And what I was doing is I was standing on a stage and I was preaching. And at this time I was a young man. I think I was 27 or 28 years old. And I was preaching and I looked out and it was just a sea of faces like, wow. I'd grown up in small churches my whole life and I'd never seen anything like this. And that moment happens. There was no words from God with it. It was just, I was there. Like I'd been transported to another place in another time. And then it was over. And I was overwhelmed, as you might imagine. I was excited. I knew we were going to go plant some kind of church. And I was like, oh man, this is going to be amazing. And I wanted to tell Jody what I had seen, but I couldn't talk. And for 3 days I couldn't talk, which if you know me, that is hard to not be able to talk. And if God would have tied my hands behind my back, I really would not have been able to communicate, right? And so I wasn't able to talk about what was going on, but you can imagine the anticipation that is beginning to build. Hey, we're going to plant a church, and wow, this thing that I have seen. And then the next year in July of 1998, we packed up everything that we had, and we moved with I believe our first son was 8 days old when we moved. So we moved to Atlanta with our baby boy to start a new church, and I was absolutely convinced that I was about to see what I had just seen. Well, we spent 10 years building that church, and I never saw anything like that moment. The church started strong. We had tremendous growth. There was a lot of momentum. But in the end, it kind of ended painfully. It ended for me miserably. And in 2008, we packed up our family again and we moved here to Charlotte to kind of put all of that behind us. You ever done that? Okay, I just got to put that behind me and we got to get out. And somewhere along the way, during that course of 10 years or more, I kind of lost that vision. God was still with me. We did amazing things. We were here. I helped start a multi-million-dollar consulting practice. There was a lot of success. There was a lot of financial success. But the promise from way back in 1997, it just faded. And by 2013, went through a series of events and circumstances, I was asked to come in the midst of everything I told you, doing the consulting thing, to be the pastor here. By that point in 2013, I'm not even sure that the vision was even a memory anymore. I think it had long been forgotten. And then on Christmas Eve 2019, one of the reasons I continue to love Christmas Eve is this. We had two services. Back then, our church was so large, we had two services all of the time. And we had two services on that Christmas Eve, and I had walked out onto this stage for the second service of the Christmas Eve, and I stood in this point. You can't see, but there's a mark where it tells me where to stand here. And the moment that I walked up and I stood right here to start that, I had the deja vu moment of all deja vu moments. It was that moment. It was the vision. It was what I saw. And I was in it. And I was overwhelmed by it because it was this place. It was this stage. And it was exactly what I had seen all those years ago. And I think what surprised me the most in that moment wasn't the level of excitement. It was just some clarity. I didn't miss the promise. I almost missed it because I was convinced that whatever that thing was that God showed me, it should have happened earlier. I was convinced that it had to happen somewhere else, in some other context, in some other thing. I was convinced that it had to look a certain way. And I was looking for God to keep his promise, but I was looking for him to keep his promise in one very specific context. And what I realized in that moment was, no, he kept it in a completely different context, in a completely different place in my life. And I tell you that story, not because it is unique. I get that it is unique, and not everybody gets to have that kind of experience. But I tell you that story because I also think it is very familiar. Because most of us, we have dreams, we have things, God has shown me something, or I feel like I have been led to do something, and you have some promise from God, and it hasn't happened. And when that happens, most of us, we don't stop believing that God keeps his promises. I never stopped believing that God keeps his promises. I just start believing that he doesn't keep his promise the way that I expect him to keep his promise. Like God has to do things in a certain way. And so you kind of have a dream of where you want to be in life and what you want to be able to do. And you begin building a picture in your head of what that is going to look like. We imagine the moment. We imagine the timing of when God comes through and does this thing. We imagine the context. And when life doesn't fit that picture, we begin to assume something. Like, maybe I got it wrong. Maybe I didn't understand exactly what was going on. Maybe I didn't hear that right. Or maybe I have now done something that has invalidated that promise. And when that goes on long enough, something in us, it begins to shift. Not in any kind of big dramatic way, not usually. Like a lot of people, these things happen, they don't walk away from faith. They don't just stop praying. Some do, but most don't. We just stop expecting. We stop expecting a whole lot in our life is actually going to change because that feels safer than being disappointed again. And maybe you're here today, rolling in on this Sunday before Christmas, carrying something like that. You know, maybe it was a prayer that you prayed and you used to be really confident that God was going to come through on this prayer, and now you're not so confident anymore. Or you had some sense of direction you thought that God was giving you and just hasn't panned out that way. Or maybe there's a hope that you had about whatever it is, and it felt very real at one point, but it has gone on so long now that that hope has kind of dwindled and faded. And what can happen over time is we adjust. We tell ourselves things like, you know what, I'm just being realistic. We say things like, I trust God, I'm just not expecting anything specific anymore. And we can think that that sounds mature, but underneath that, what I've learned in my own life is there's just a grief we don't talk about, because deep down, we're not just waiting, we're protecting ourselves from hoping too much again. Now, I can't speak for you, and I can speak for me, and here's something that I've learned now in the 50-something years that I've been around dealing with this. The hardest part of faith for me isn't trusting God during the waiting. Now, I will say it used to be, but I've spent a whole lot of time waiting. This is not the hard part anymore. I've kind of reached the place where God is going to do something, I expect to wait. It's kind of like going to Popeyes for chicken. You just expect to wait a really long time because they're not going to have chicken, even though it's a chicken place. But anyway. The hardest part for me is not trusting him during the waiting. The hardest part for me is recognizing that God is faithful when it finally arrives in a form I didn't expect. That's the hard part for me. What do I mean by that is when it shows up and you go, wow, I didn't expect that. I didn't expect it to look like that. And then recognizing, no, that's God's promise. It just looks different. It's just at a different time. It doesn't match the picture that we've had for years. Maybe it shows up in a completely different season of your life. When God gave me that vision in 1997, we were newly married. I had no children. When I walked onto this stage, I had kids in high school. I had one kid in college. Completely different phase of life. And we can just be like, God, are you ever going to? Are you ever going to? It just isn't what we expected. That is the world that Jesus is born into. A world full of people who still believed that God can act. They just weren't sure that he still would. People who knew all of the promises of the Messiah, but they had stopped looking for it because it had gone on for so long. So when you come to Luke chapter 2, what you begin to read isn't just a familiar Christmas story. It's the moment that God keeps a promise that people had been waiting for centuries to see fulfilled. And because of that, almost everyone misses it because it doesn't look like they thought it should. So Luke chapter 2. This is how Luke frames up the Christmas story. At that time, the Roman Emperor Augustus decreed that a census should be taken throughout the Roman Empire. Now, we've read that as many times as we've read the Christmas story. But this is how Luke chooses to open and put things into a context. Because immediately in this verse, we are introduced to the person who actually is in control of everything going on in the known world at this point. When the Caesar speaks, things happen. Sometimes they're good, a lot of times they're not. When he makes a decision, millions of lives are disrupted. So Luke starts here on purpose. Because if you're watching history unfold in real time, you would assume that the story of God's redemption would start in the center of power, where the person who can change the world in a snap resides. So Luke at least acknowledges and takes us to that place. Verse 3 says, all returned. So all the people had to return to their own ancestral towns to register for this census. So the Caesar comes up with something, and now everyone's lives are disrupted. This means travel for most people. This means disruption. Mary and Joseph, who we know the story about, it takes them between 7 and 10 days to make the journey. There's a lot of disruption that's going on because of some decision that some guy made in a foreign land that seems kind of distant, seems very impersonal. There is nothing spiritual in people's minds about what is going on right now. It's very bureaucratic, very inconvenient. And because Joseph was a descendant of King David, he had to go to Bethlehem in Judea, David's ancient home. He traveled there from the village of Nazareth in Galilee, and he took with him Mary, to whom he was engaged, who was now expecting a child. So Joseph is like, hey, we got to go do this thing. And he takes Mary with him, and she is greatly pregnant. He's not connecting any kind of spiritual dots now. He's probably having to deal with a complaining wife or fiance. That's odd in the story, right? Ladies, how many of you would like to go on a 10-day journey just days before you give birth? Of which you're either riding on an animal or walking. It's not first class on American. Like Joseph isn't thinking about it. He's just responding to circumstances. Joseph didn't choose this. This was chosen for him. And Mary, again, she's pregnant. She's tired. She's vulnerable. Nothing about this moment feels sacred. Nothing about this moment feels like God is keeping a promise. If anything, this is the worst timing possible. I could imagine Joseph saying that all the prophecies have said, hey, you're about to give birth to this Christ child. Really, this moment, God, this is really inconvenient. Could you work this out better? Verse 6. And while they're there, the time came for her baby to be born. You cannot state how strikingly understated this sentence is. There is no build-up. There is no explanation. There is no timing. Just boom, the time has come. And I can tell you, it ain't Mary's timing, and it ain't Joseph's timing. She would be like, we need to do this at home. But it was God's timing. She gave birth to her firstborn son. She wrapped him snugly in strips of cloth and laid him in a manger because there was no lodging for them. So this baby is born. They put him in a feeding trough. The fulfillment of centuries of promises. It arrives quietly, humbly, without recognition. There's not even a room that's prepared. No announcement. No sign in the moment that this is anything all that important. But this is the moment that an entire nation has been waiting centuries for, generations upon generations, and almost no one notices because it doesn't look like what they had pictured. And this is exactly what Luke wants us to know. God keeps his promises, but often quietly. God will keep his promises, but a lot of times they're just quiet. Jesus arrives quietly, wrapped in ordinary circumstances that were easy to overlook. And so I think the question for us isn't whether or not God keeps his promises. I think Luke makes that very clear, that God keeps his promises. But the harder question is, how do we recognize his faithfulness when it shows up inside ordinary life? How do we recognize that it's God being faithful when it's just regular, ordinary life? The opening of the Christmas story, it tells us that it is possible to be much closer to the thing that you have been praying for, hoping for, longing for than you realize, and still miss it because it doesn't look like you expected. This is not how it's supposed to work out. This is not how I imagined it. This does not fit the picture. And I know that because I lived it. I stepped on this stage for 6 years, week after week. We did 2 services every Sunday during that 6 years. So you just do the math. 600 times I walked onto this stage. Never saw it. I just kind of missed it. It never occurred to me that I was already living in the vision that God had given me. But nothing about it really felt that dramatic. It felt like work. It felt like responsibility. It felt ordinary. And because of that, I really didn't recognize it for what it was. In that experience, it still makes me wonder, not just about what happened in 97 and all this and all those things, but about my life now. It makes me wonder, how many other places in my life is God doing something and I've missed it because I'm not recognizing it? Because it's just ordinary. There's nothing spectacular or special about it. And I think we all can do that. It's not just me. Right? We carry, like I said, a picture in our head. This is how God is going to come through. This is what God is going to do. This is when it's going to happen. This is how it's going to change. This is how quickly the turnaround is going to take place. And when God doesn't follow that picture, I don't think you quit believing in God. You just stop expecting. Well, I guess it's just not going to happen. And we tell ourselves we're being realistic. But again, we're just protecting ourselves from disappointment. And what I believe is we leave room for God. If we're a person of faith, we'll leave room for God, but we don't leave any room for anticipation, wonder, amazement. And once we're living that way, it becomes really easy to miss the kinds of places God usually works. Because God often does his deepest work in places that don't feel spiritual at all. I don't know if you figured that out. God generally does his deepest work in routines, in all of those disruptions that just drive you crazy, in moments that we are tempted to just rush past because they feel like obstacles instead of answers. And so as I was writing this, I thought, maybe the question that we need to sit with this week isn't why hasn't God come through yet? You've probably asked that a million times. God, why haven't you come through? God, why haven't you come through? But I don't think that that's the question. I think the question, if I'm reading through Luke and I'm thinking about my own experience, is, God, where might you already be at work? And I'm just missing it. Where is it that you're already doing something and I just can't see it because it's so ordinary? It doesn't look like what I've expected. Maybe it's a relationship that it's like, I need this relationship to be fixed, and you so desperately need it to be fixed. But if you step back and look, it hasn't really fallen apart either. Or a season that hasn't been resolved. But if you step back and look, man, that season is shaping me into something beautiful and wonderful. Or maybe it's a step forward that feels smaller than you had prayed for or less than you expect, but you're still making progress. One of the reasons I love the Bible is the realism that's in the Bible. You can read all the way through it. People in the Bible respond exactly like you and I respond, and I love that. The Bible never pretends that people always recognize what God is doing in the moment that he's doing it. That actually is rarely the case, seldom the case. And in fact, Luke doesn't even tell us that Mary and Joseph understood what God was doing in that moment. He simply is telling us, hey, God is faithful anyway. And out of that, here's something that I've learned. Clarity often comes later, doesn't it? Clarity comes later. Like, oh, that's what God was doing. Oh, now I see. Recognition comes later. Meaning often comes later. And for some of us, that is God's invitation right now. Not to force you into some sort of fake optimism, to put on some sort of manufactured smile, or to create some sort of hope that you don't actually have. God's call is to just stay attentive to what he's doing, to stay open. And not to assume that his silence is his absence. Because if God can keep his greatest promise in a moment that almost everyone missed, then isn't it at least possible that he's doing something real in your life right now and you just can't see it? That moment in 2019 when I walked right here, it didn't suddenly make everything clear for me. It's not like everything in my life, oh, now everything makes sense. It didn't. It answered some questions, yes, but it didn't answer every question, and didn't mean that I stopped wrestling with expectations and disappointment. In fact, do you recall what happened just a few months past December of 2019? I mean, how do you remember what happened in March of 2020? Overnight, our church changed. We were on a tremendous growth curve, and all of a sudden, we shrank almost instantly. The room that you're in just went quiet. The momentum that we felt, it was interrupted. And like a lot of you, I was left with a lot of questions, and a lot of questions that I still don't have any answers to. So that recognition in 2019 was not a finish line. It wasn't God saying, now everything's going to make sense. It was simply a reminder that God had been faithful in ways that I had not recognized. Therefore, he is still faithful, and can I recognize them? I didn't stop believing God during that season, but I did have to learn something and wrestle with this. God can be faithful and present even when outcomes are uncertain. God can be faithful and present even when the next chapter doesn't look like it's progressing the way that you think it should. And maybe you're here today and that's where you find yourself. Maybe you're not, doubting God or rejecting faith, but maybe you're coming in and you had something that was in front of you and it hasn't happened and it's gone on so long that now you're just tired. You would call yourself careful, but you're guarded. You would call yourself a person of faith, but quietly on the inside, you are really unsure that God is doing anything in your life in places that really matter to you. Maybe that's you. And if that's where you're at, the Christmas story, it matters more to you than you realize. Because the Christmas story tells us that God doesn't wait for us to be certain. God doesn't wait for us to be hopeful or confident before He moves. He enters the story when people are distracted with everyday life. They are overwhelmed, just trying to get through. And He shows up quietly, without forcing recognition, without demanding that anyone immediately understand what He's doing. But He's there. Jesus doesn't arrive as proof that everything is instantly going to make sense. He arrives as proof that God has not stepped away from the world. In fact, He has stepped into. God has not stepped away from you. He has stepped towards you. That's Christmas. And the invitation of the gospel isn't about getting your act together. I know that that's common. Oh, I need to do this, I need to do that. That is not the invitation of the gospel. The invitation of the gospel is to trust in what is actually already true, in the thing that is true. Is that you may have stepped away, but God has stepped toward you. And we put our trust in that, even if we don't see it. And I think some of us trusting Jesus today is probably kind of that simple. Maybe it's not anything really dramatic, but it's simply letting go of that grip of the picture of how something's supposed to look, how it's supposed to happen, and the timing of it, and just saying, I trust you. As He has already stepped towards you. Might look like saying, look, I don't see it clearly yet. God, I can't see what's going on. I'm just going to trust that you're doing something. And if that's where you're at, I've done this thing for a long time. I'm here to tell you there is no formula. There's no formula for you to repeat. There's no magic words that you have to say just right. Trust is what matters. Alignment to what is true matters. Relationship matters. And so I'm going to give us a quiet moment. Not to force anything, not to manufacture any emotion, just some space. And if you find yourself ready to trust Jesus, to stop carrying the things that you were never meant to carry in the first place, you might simply just say something in your own words. God, I'm open. Help me trust you with what I can't control. Because the promise that took place in that manger is telling us that God is already closer than we think, even when we don't recognize Him. He is faithful. That's the hope that we move towards this Christmas. So let's pray. We're going to take a moment. And again, we're all coming in from different places here. And while you are in that posture of prayer, let me just speak to you and say, you got nothing to prove. You don't have to prove anything. Just take a moment. Jesus, we come to you right where we are. Not as we wish we were, not with everything figured out, but Jesus, we come to you just as we are. And for some of us today, hope has stirred up inside of us again. For some of us today, if we're honest, it's just stirred up questions. And Jesus, for some of us, this has stirred up memories that we didn't expect. And you see all of it. Jesus, I just want to thank you for being faithful. Even when we don't recognize what you are doing, even when your work arrives quietly, even when it comes wrapped in ordinary life, thank you for not stepping away from us. You don't step away when we're tired or when we're careful or when we're guarded. And God, for those of us in this room who are carrying disappointment, who are carrying uncertainty or questions that just don't have answers yet, Jesus, would you meet us right there? Not with any kind of pressure, not with explanations that we're not ready for. Just your presence. Just be there. And Jesus, for anyone who's realizing today that they've been carrying more than they were meant to carry, they've been trying to control outcomes, trying to protect themselves from disappointment, trying to manage life on their own, would you just gently remind them that they don't have to live that way anymore? And so Jesus, thank you for coming into the world the way you did, not loudly, not forcefully, but quietly, faithfully. Thank you for stepping into our condition, for carrying what we can't, and for showing us that we are not on our own. And for those of us who are ready to trust you, maybe for the first time or maybe in a deeper way than we have ever trusted you before, God, give them the courage to open their hearts. Not anything rehearsed, not anything manipulated, just open and trusting. And so Jesus, we place our lives back into your care. Jesus, we place our future, our questions, our unfinished stories. And as we move towards Christmas, help us to stay attentive. Help us to stay open. Help us notice the ways you are already closer than we think. Jesus, I trust you. And we trust you. Thank you for being here.